welcome back to another reading and correcting of A Wasteful Death. With me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger's supervisor. Today we are doing Chapter 9. Marlot popped a piece of meat he'd taken from the cooler as soon as he'd gotten in, and accessed Aiden's pad from his computer. What he'd eaten at home hadn't been enough to satisfy him. Normally, it was the enforcer's job to extract information from any electronic device owned by the victim. But that fell low on their list of priority. Waiting on them, it would be days, if not weeks, until he got results. Fortunately, he'd gone through the needed certifications and was authorized to do the extraction, so he'd requested it couriered overnight. Elahan had handed it to him when he got in. What he wanted to get off Aiden's pad was the list of her conquests. He knew it wasn't there. Prowlers like her always kept track of who they used. He got in easily. Since she had been vice president of Arcos, he'd expected her to have better security than the simple password he bypassed. She did have encrypted files, made up close to half the content of her pad. He sent the unencrypted data to Trembor's computer for him to peruse while he worked at breaking the encryptions. They were high grade. Marlot was familiar with basic encryption mode as well as many of the more obscure ones, but he had to call on expert to identify Aiden's. Once he knew which one had been used, he did a little research and wrote a program to assemble the encryption key. You okay? Trembor looked at him. Marlot had been fidgeting for a few. Just thinking about Telema. Marlot stood and stretched. Who? The jackal from Aiden's place. What about him? I'm just thinking that once we catch Aiden's killer, her history as a prowler is going to be devastated. Finds out she was just using him. Or rubbed the back of his neck. You can't be sure of that. He's completely in love with her. And he believes she was in love with him. How they work. Trust me. When he finds out, it's going to shatter his world. The lion shrugged. Okay, but it isn't like he can do anything about it. Marlot rested against his desk. I can tell him about the cub. He nodded thoughtfully to himself. His eyes narrowed in giant anger. And he told the wolf that cubs weren't a piece of meat dangled in front of someone hungry. Yeah, now I see the comments about head hopping. Huh. That's amusing from looking at it now, because even that early, it is something I was conscious of. And I really thought I'd not done it. But yeah. Yep. Marlot didn't notice the lion's reaction. Too busy with his own thoughts to hear Trembor's tail lashing about and hitting the side of the chair. Trembor waited for his anger to pass. There was no point in getting into an argument. That smart? Finally asked. Couldn't see any good coming from this, but maybe it was a lesson Marlot needed to learn firsthand. Still a cub himself, how is he going to deal with learning that he lost both the female he loved and his cub? It'll hurt, but at least he'll be able to use that against those who will say she was using him. But if it's not his, it is. Marlot was confident. Alicon said she'd been on anti-pregnancy medication until 5 months ago. It would have taken a while for her system to clear them out, and when Telema got her pregnant before Alicon, then Telema got her pregnant before Alicon. He looked at the lion's eye. He looked into the lion's eyes. You know, that kind of female. She wasn't going to risk what she had by having sex with another male. Trevor stared back and focused on keeping his tone neutral. Didn't want an argument. You know how I feel about using a cub that way. This isn't like yesterday. I don't know. You don't know what it's like to be used by a female like her and then just thrown away. I'm not going to wave the cub in front of him and take it away. I want to give him something to hang on to want to give him something to hang on to wow. I want something to give him to hang on. The knowledge that she loved him enough to have his cub. Trembor studied his lover for a moment. You're right. I don't know what that's like. Still, actually, that's still valid. Okay, I just realized events in future books had the potential of contradicting that, but you're right. I don't know what that's like. I don't think you're making a mistake, but pause. Just be careful when you tell him. Okay? Marlot nodded and grabbed his jacket. The computer is going to keep to beep when the program's done. It doesn't lock, so you can go through the files. The files then. You read out the door without giving Trembor time to reply. The lion shook his head sadly. Watched the wolf vanish. The thing, I know why I didn't think I was doing head hopping. Because in my head, everything that's said can be justified as being something the lion notices. But yeah, it's head hopping. Sorry about that, the burly bear in the security uniform said as he handed Marlot's ID back, and then gave him a visitor's badge. Just go to the administration building. Advisor Shortpelt will be waiting for you. Marlot thanked the guard and drove in, marveling at the size of the campus. He knew it covered 20 city blocks. I didn't realize how much space that was until now. When he thought about the academy, he'd imagined something closer to what he'd experienced in his hometown. 3 buildings, rarely more than half full. He drove slowly, both to make sure not to hit any of the students who crossed the road without checking for incoming cars, and to watch the students themselves. He hadn't expected the species to mix as much as he saw. Back home, it was expected for prey species to see to the education of their own cubs. After all, as long as they knew how to farm the land, it'd be okay. Here, predators and prey intermingled. They laughed, they played together. That was the advantage of studying in the largest no predation zone in this city. It was also why the academy needed guards. A lot of homeless and others with low productivity rating tried to get on campus for protection. There were legitimate ways to gain access, mainly by taking courses, but those were expensive. So almost by virtue of where they stood in the food chain, many of those who needed the protection the campus offered couldn't afford to take the courses. Schooling was free for cubs. They spent 10 years here learning the basics of functioning in society, as well as a trade of their choice. By the time they reached the age of predation, it was expected they had learned everything they needed to lead a productive life. Those who wanted to pursue more study had to find a way to pay for them. Wealthy families could afford to have cubs continue on to higher studies, but the rest were sponsored by companies looking for talents to boost their rank. Marlot had known early on that he was going to be a registered investigator. He'd been the only one in the town to take that course. There wasn't much call for RIs in smaller towns. He'd studied hard and graduated at the top of the 10% in the country. This ensured his productivity started high, and it gave him time to build a reputation. Within 2 years, his territory grew to include half a dozen other towns that didn't have their own RIs. The road led to the administration building. He parked in the half-full lot and entered. I don't need the building again. Can I help you? A yak seated beyond the reception desk asked. R.I. Blacklaw, I'm here to see Advisor Shortpelt. Only students and faculty were allowed to move freely within the academy. Everyone else needed to talk to one of the advisors before being authorized. Even if he could have gone directly to Talima, he wanted to ask his advisor a few questions. Just a moment. She made a call. She didn't show any of the usual nervous sign prey showed around predators they didn't know. It was probably because she spent so much time inside a no predation zone. Marlot made a mental note of her name to add to his list of potential meals. Her lack of nervousness could mean she was careless when she was off campus. Only for that, it would be worth the research time to find out what range or rating fell in. Investigator Blacklaw, small equine, walked down the hall. She extended her hand to him. I'm Sterin Shortpelt. What do you want with Telima? Marlot shook it, and she too was unusually calm around him. He didn't bother making note of her name. As an academic advisor, there was no way he could have. How is he doing? I am not aware of anything wrong with him. She led him to her office. Should I be? It was a small space, barely large enough for her desk and the 2 chairs. I'm investigating the unclaimed death of someone he was close to. She sat on the chair before her desk. The female he's seeing. Marlot nodded. I'd wondered why he came back on his rest day. When he started seeing her, he rearranged his schedule so that his rest days were consecutive, and he always spent them away from the academy grounds. I'm guessing at her place. Did you know her? No, but I know of her. She's a prowler. Every year she comes to the academy under the pretense of looking for potential recruits for her company, but she spends all her time in the gym. She ruined a lot of students' lives, so when I found out Telema was seeing her, I kept an eye on him and tried to make sure he didn't sacrifice his future for her. Why hasn't anyone tried to stop her from prowling here? There have been a few attempts, but what she's doing isn't illegal, technically. And her company does pay for the tuition of many students. Every time she's been able to leverage that against the objection any advisor raise. Well, it should be illegal. Barely kept a growl out of his voice. Do you know if anyone kept a list of the cubs she's prowled? Darren did a search through their system. It doesn't look like they did. Sorry. It's all right. Out of curiosity, do you pay this close attention to all the students under your care? She laughed. If only I could. I do try to catch any at-risk student, which Telema became when a prowler targeted him. I've been doing my best to remind him that as fun as it is being in love with someone rich, that his studies are important. Marlot nodded. Do you have any objection if I go see Telema? No. He asked for his badge and inserted it into the slot on the keyboard. A few keystrokes later, she returned it. He's in history class right now. I've given you access to that building and that class. Connect your pad to the Academy network and you'll be able to access the map. Marlot thanked her. The building was close by, so he walked there. History class was held in a large, partial amphitheater with a dozen rows of desks, half of which were filled. The instructor was a rabbit, and she was seated at the desk on a raised dais. The cubs were bent over their pad, either reading or writing. The rabbit glanced at her pad, then up at him. He leaned against the wall while he waited for the class to end. So different from a classroom he learned in. It had been a small room with no more than 15 desks. He spent his 10 years in the same classroom, same 8 cubs. The rabbit stood and moved in front of the desk. All right, you can finish the rest after class. Cub looked around in surprise, but put their pads away. A few of them looked at the clock in the center of the wall above the instructor. I'm going to throw a few questions at you, she said. This isn't for points. Think of it as an impromptu practice for the upcoming test. Now, who can tell me when the productivity tax was first introduced? Hands went up. That crook? The badger she indicated looked around nervously. Well, do you mean the rating tax or the original documented case of tax being paid? That's very good. What's the difference? That caught the badger unprepared. Well, the rating tax system is a result of the computerized census. The initial case was, he hesitated, well, it was the first time we know someone paid money for having eaten someone. Very good, Dekruk. When did that happen? In the year 503. Correct. Now, who can tell me who decided what the amount was and why he required it to be paid? More hands went up. Jalapin. An antelope stood. It was King Arshemesh V, and he had to ask for money because it was the peace envoy who ate his favorite valet. Normally, he'd just have eaten the person responsible, but that would have started a war he was trying to avoid. So he asked for money instead. Correct. Do you know how much he asked for? Marlot had to think back on his own history. I thought it had been 200 gold shilling. It was 220 claws, the rabbit answered. After the class went on. Answered herself after the silence went on. It's the first documented case of value being applied to a worker. Before then, protection was provided by the employer. As far as we know, that incident is what led to the creation of the system we now call the productivity rating system, which calculates how much each and every one of us is worth to society, and therefore how much needs to be paid as a tax if we're killed. She looked the class over. The reason I brought this up is that we have a registered investigator with us today. The class gasped in surprise, which amused Marlot. Then they looked around over their shoulder at him. He straightened and smoothed down his jacket under the gaze of the student. Investor Blackclaw, would you come down here, please? Thought about declining, but everyone was looking at him expectantly. He swallowed, never having had that many people looking at him at once before walking down the steps to join the instructor. He looked at the students once he was next to her, and his tail hugged his leg. Looking out at them, felt like he was back before the town council, about to have them berate him for taking too long and decided who the killer had been. It was silly. He knew it, but he still couldn't shake the feeling. Can you tell the class what it is exactly you do? He looked at her, and for a moment he thought he understood what prey felt like the moment it realized a predator was at its sight on it. Well, I investigate unclaimed death. She smiled warmly at him, and that didn't make him feel any better. Maybe you can go into some more detail. Tell us how you came to become an investigator? Desire to flee reared up again. Looked at the class over and swallowed. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at this. He noticed Dilemma on the fourth row and looked at him with some apprehension. Carlos focused on him. He could talk to him. Took a few breaths and remembered what he'd learned during our class. The role of the register investigator used to be performed by the enforcers. They would investigate anyone who disappeared to find out if they had been eaten. Until the census and rating system was set in place 40 years ago or so, it was hard to ensure PRT was paid. There was no easy way to keep track of who had died and who had just moved away. Once the systems were in place, it became simpler to keep track of that, and therefore enforced collecting the tax. The first department to be separated from the enforcer was the Missing Persons Bureau, which looked into people who disappeared without leaving a body. When the census was first started, it's estimated that only 30 to 40% of the people killing prey paid the tax. 20 years later, we're up to 90%. At that point, the government decided it wasn't worth having the enforcers do it anymore. They had more important matters to deal with. So they created a new position, the RI. These days, the payment rate is above 99%. I took my RI course at the academy. Well, the one back home. I'm from a farming town a few hours away. But anyone can apply to become an RI. If you pass a qualification test, you'll be put on a waiting list. When a territory becomes available, it's assigned to the person at the top of the list. Thank you, Investigator Blackclaw. Marlot only now noticed the cub was fidgeting. He looked over his shoulder and the clock was pulsing between red and green, indicating the class was over. Delima, please stay behind, he said as the student got up. That was very textbook of you, she whispered to Marlot. I'm sorry, that's all I could think to say. Smile. It's all right. Sorry for putting you on the spot. She took her pad and vest and left the classroom. Marlot and Telema were the only ones left. The jackal was still in his chair, so Marlot climbed up to the third row. Hi. The worry in Telema's eyes was apparent. In trouble? Marlot gave him the most reassuring smile he could. No, you're fine. I just needed to talk with you. He looked around the classroom. There's someplace we can go. I expect they're going to need the room. We can go to my room. I don't have any other classes today. He put his pad in a pocket and stood. Marlot followed him, and he was doing the right thing. Trembor's words echoed in his. Did he have the right to burden Telema at an entered predation age with the knowledge she had been bearing his cubs? He pushed the question away. He was doing this to reinforce Telema's belief that Aiden had loved him. She had carried his cub, so no one would be able to convince him he had only been a toy for her. He didn't want Telema to go through the devastation that realization could bring. Says Marlot, would bring. Telema's room was small. It held a bed, a dresser, and a desk, which left barely enough space to move about. The jackal sat on his bed. So, the cub asked. Marlot hesitated. Aiden was carrying your cub when she died. Oh. Was all Telema said, but Marlot smelled the shock off him. Jekyll looked down at for a long time. The room was silent. The scent changed to grief and up at his gaze. See it? The voice was barely above a whisper. Marlot crouched before him and had to force himself not to react to the smell. It was only conceived 2 months ago. No, there isn't much to see. Please, Jekyll pleaded. I'm the father. Don't I have the right to see my cub? The pain in Telema's voice made Marlot creep. Right. I'll make the arrangement. I'll call you when everything's ready. I nodded, back to looking. Marlot fled the room. The smell of despair surrounding the Jekyll almost made him sick. He cursed under it. How he could have been so stupid. There was no way the pain he'd felt after being dumped had been greater than what he smelled coming off Telema. He almost ran to the advisor's office. At least she wasn't in. He had no idea how he could explain what he'd just done. Thought about waiting for her to come back, but instead left a message for the secretary to check in Telema. He sat in his car for half an hour, trying to decide what to do. Part of him wanted to go back inside, find the advisor, and tell her exactly what he'd said. The other wanted him to start the car and drive as fast and far from here as possible. He jumped when his pad beeped and fumbled for it. Hello? He said, barely managing to keep his voice from cracking. Hey, it's me, Cooper said. I've gone through the list on Aiden's pad. Are you sure? Are you done with the Jekyll? Marlot sighed at the sound of Trembor's deep voice. Yeah, I'm done. I'll head back to the office. You don't have to. A couple of... Trembor's voice trailed off. Are you okay? Marlot closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat. He should have known Trembor would pick up on it. I tried to say he was okay. Screwed up. You were right. Shouldn't have told him. Trembor was silent. Do you want to postpone questioning your old lovers? Finally asked, keeping his tone soft. Marlot thought it over. Right now, all he wanted was to curl up against his lion, have him soothe his worries away, have him say that everything would be okay. He wanted for someone else to deal with this mess. But he wasn't a cub who could go hide under his mother's tail. He was a full-grown hunter. Job to do. Now, the best thing all around is to get the killer and give Telema closure. I'll come pick you up. He blinked a couple of times before wiping the wetness away. You don't have to. I patted Sarek earlier. He's one of my brothers. He's going to bring my car around. We have so many people to see that it's best if we split up, and some of them are close to the academy. Marlot nodded, disappointed he wouldn't get to see Trembor right then. Okay, pad me their information and I'll get started. This concludes chapter 9 of A Wasteful Death. If you are enjoying this, please go like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story as well as the others of the series, they are available on all major e-retailer. If you want to support me, that's on my Patreon, where you can also get access to just about everything I've written. Want to listen to me do these live? It's every Tuesday morning on Twitch, 8 a.m. Eastern Time. The links are in the notes. That I shall wish you a good day.